The title of today's lecture is What Physics Do You Believe in? The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Rise of the Scientific Worldview. And this title is a real question. What physics do you believe in? Of all the different ways of doing physics, which one do you prefer? For that matter, which way do you prefer to do math? Which way do you like to add 2 plus 2? And which number do you want to arrive at? Now, you're probably a little perplexed by this question because it's a trick question. There is only one way to do physics, right? There are certain laws, actually laws, that you must follow. Same thing with math. You can't add 2 plus 2 and arrive at whatever number you want. You do addition and it always equals 4. But I posed this question at the beginning of this lecture to lay out the kind of stakes that we're talking about. If we could be transported back to 1500 and assemble a group of people in Europe and ask them, what Christian denomination do you believe in? They would look at you with the same kind of perplexed faces that you probably had when I asked you the question about physics. They wouldn't know how to answer because there's one church, the Universal Catholic Church. Now, if we fast forward 50 years to 1650, we will have a wealth of answers. People will readily tell you, I am Lutheran, I am Catholic, I am an Anabaptist. The type of change that entails, to go from everyone believing one thing to everyone believing many different things, placed a lot of stress and strain on that society, and even violence. And so we can imagine in 50 years being able to do math or physics however you might want, the kind of stress and strain we would have to go through to get there. Now, I will go over the theses, the arguments that I'm going to make in this particular lecture. The first is humanism came to prominence with the Renaissance and the Reformation. And humanism is a worldview that stresses the value of humans rather than the supernatural. Meanwhile, the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, and the scientific revolution harnessed a new technology, the printing press, to spread new ideas about humans in the universe. And these developments led to intellectual uncertainty and social chaos. My second thesis is that as information expands, the systems of control over information also expand. For example, expanding state bureaucracies in the Catholic Church's Inquisition attempted to solve, or in other words, control, the information problems created by the printing press, just as state surveillance and big tech try to solve the data problems of today, whether we have too much information or misinformation, right, or the right information. A corollary to this problem we have can be found during this early modern period. Now, to highlight these theses and how they played out for average people, I'm going to focus on two individuals here. The first is a woman by the name of Anneken van der Hove, and she lived in the Low Countries. She lived in Brussels. She was a woman in her mid-40s, and she was a domestic servant for two ladies, and all three of them were Anabaptists. Now, Anabaptist doesn't mean anti-Baptist. They're not against baptism. Anabaptists believed that an individual should wait till they're an adult to make a choice about whether or not they will become a Christian. Now, we might think that's no big deal, but back then, your baptism was basically your citizenship. It was your right to exist in society. It was your passport. It was your driver's license. It was your insurance card. And saying that you didn't want that or wanted to wait to get it until you're old enough, you thought you were old enough, simply violated every rule of that society. And so, Anneken's, when they were caught, her and her compatriots, her employers quickly recanted, said, I'm sorry, we apologize, we're actually Catholic, and they were let go. Anneken, meanwhile, sat in prison for 3 years, and after many interviews, after a trial, she was required to strip naked, and she was taken outside the town walls. And to quote an individual who witnessed this, as the executioners threw earth upon her body up to her throat, they begged her to recant and deny her faith. But it was all in vain, so they at last threw much additional earth and sods upon her face and whole body, and stamped with their feet upon it, in order that she should die sooner. Anneken was a threat to this society, an existential threat. Our second example comes to us from 1,400 miles away in Rome. And here, at the same time, the Dominican friar Giordano Bruno was in his 5th year of imprisonment at the Tower of Nuna. And he claimed that the earth revolved around the sun, and not only that, but there were many other suns and universes besides. Now, this also ran afoul of the Catholic authorities because, for a couple reasons, really. For one, it violated the Bible, right? That's good enough. But it also suggested that humans are not at the center of God's universe. We are not special. And that was a very powerful existential threat also to the Catholic Church. So as a result, he languished a few more years in prison. Then eventually he was taken outside, hung upside down naked, and burned at the stake. And his ashes were thrown in the Tiber River. His works were then placed on the Catholic Church's Index of Prohibited Works in 1603. Both of these individuals challenged the Catholic Church and paid the price for it. Now, during the medieval period, the period just before the period we're talking about, truth, with capital T, was singular, universal, and dictated by the Catholic Church in Rome. And when I say truth, I mean an entire mythology. The past, the present, time, space, reality, what is real and what is not real. And this surety about right and wrong, time and space, God and humanity, in short, this entire mythology was destroyed between 1520 and 1620. This is the stress and strain that I mentioned earlier. It happened because Protestant theologians and early scientists developed new religious and scientific truths that were based on this concept of humanism, an outlook that stresses the value of human rather than supernatural matters. Now, most of these individuals wished to reform the Catholic Church in order to reflect this human-centered knowledge. But when they were denied, they promoted their own religious and scientific truths via the printing press, or the Internet 1.0. Now, the printing press was developed in Europe by Johannes Gutenberg in the 1450s. It was a Chinese invention, or even maybe a Korean invention, that was transported west, and he made it useful and usable in the Western context. Even more so because we have a much more limited character set than Chinese, for instance. And here you can see on the image individuals pressing ink, and you can really generate a lot of printed material in a day. 3,600 pages to be precise, versus about 40 pages if it was done by hand. And yes, one of the very first big money makers for printing, as with the internet, was pornography. Now, despite setbacks, the result of all this, and to note here, there were setbacks. Actually, the printing press as an invention didn't really take off for several decades. Johannes Gutenberg actually died poor because there was no network for print distribution. The culture of the printed word did not yet exist. That had to come into being. Sellers, buyers, marketing, etc. Despite these setbacks, the result was the transmission of more and more varied information across Europe. Now, with all this new information being generated by the printing presses, right, and including here a lot of materials from the ancient past, from the Greeks and the Romans and also the Bible, and as the result of this, scientific and religious reformers could go back to original sources, way back when, it's called ad fontes, to learn human-centered ways of producing new knowledge and be able to determine the accuracy of the Catholic Church's teachings. And this led to the Renaissance and the Reformation, back to the future. So first, a little note here on humanism and how it affected the mindset of European society. It was a new way of thought, developed in 1300s, 1400s. It's a little nebulous, its beginnings, but it prioritized human rather than supernatural interpretations for things. It stresses the goodness of humans instead of their sinfulness, and it seeks material and not spiritual solutions for human problems. This is a big departure from the way of thinking that was popular during the medieval period, where humans sort of supplicated themselves to God. They felt themselves to be terribly sinful. And here we see, right, some humanist art through the Renaissance painter Michelangelo. God, right, almost on the same level as humans. God, in fact, almost, touching Adam here. And humanism stresses that human thoughts are important. They can improve the human condition. And that's also important because even though humanist ideas were developed by elites, its fruits were available to all. Humanism also created the modern artist and author. And here we have an example of that, Albrecht Dürer, a famous German-speaking artist during the late early 1500s. He was the first celebrity artist. Let's take a look at him here. First of all, he's painting a picture of himself. He himself is important enough to be painted. And also, who does he look like? He looks a bit like Jesus, doesn't he? Right? So not only is he painting himself, he's painting himself looking like Jesus. And notice those hands. He's not giving a sign of blessing, right? He's stroking his beautiful fur coat that he bought with his money that he made selling his art. And after they became so popular, he realized others were copying his prints. And so he was the first person to create a trademark. And you can see that there right beside his head, AD. And there are several lawsuits to prove that this way of trademarking your work worked. Now, he was, with this painting, perhaps the first Jesus, the original Jesus. Moving on, we have Martin Luther, the first celebrity or best-selling author, so known. What I mean by that is people would buy Luther's work based on the fact that they'd already read his earlier work and they liked it. Without even reading it, they would buy it. To give you an example of his popularity, 1/3 of all German language books sold between 1518 and 1525 were written by Martin Luther. And now we'll talk about the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, because Luther is the individual that sets that in motion. Now, by 1500, the Catholic Church was too distant and sophisticated to really convey reality to average Europeans. And the Pope, pictured there, was politically powerful and distant from average Europeans. The reigning way of thinking about the Bible and the world in the Catholic Church at that time, at least among its scholars and theologians, was called scholasticism. And scholasticism transformed biblical commands into language exercises. The point of scholasticism was to find tension between different passages in the Bible and then try and rectify them so the entire Bible was a cohesive entity. Now, this is very scholarly, it's very erudite, and most people really didn't care about scholasticism. They didn't really understand it. And average people, for their part, tuned all of that out, typically worshipped local saints, and were fairly indifferent to church hierarchy, even if they might really love and respect their local priest. Now, does this sound a little familiar? I think presently in today's society, we really see a divide between individuals at elite institutions, at universities and so forth, that often have their own discourse in a lot of different disciplines that average people really don't understand. They don't get it, and they often tune it out. There's a disconnect often between things that educated elites in our society think and talk about and average people do. Now, Martin Luther comes into this situation inspired by humanism. He wanted individuals to have a relationship with God. That was his main goal. The result of this was Protestantism, for instance, Lutheranism, Methodism, etc. And what was the big sticking point for Luther were indulgences. And here you can see one pictured. What you would do is if you had a relative that died before they were right with God, you would go and buy an indulgence from the Catholic Church. And there's a saying, and it sounds better in German, but I'll say it in English. When the coin in the coffer clinks, the soul from purgatory springs. And there you can see the top picture, an individual buying an indulgence. Now, Luther thought this was wrong. He thought that people should be able to know or experience salvation without having to pay for it. He said that salvation is actually a gift. It's not a commodity. And Luther wanted to bring these individuals into direct contact with God and cut out the middleman. And in this case, the Catholic Church, the most powerful institution in Europe, is that middleman. Now, when you do that, when you cut out the church and its hierarchy and all of its ceremonies and rituals and things, churches become just buildings, communion just becomes bread and wine, and anyone who can read can be a pastor. This did not go over well with Catholic authorities, right? Just ask Annika. So Luther brought his message to people via the printing press, and he printed a new biblical and abstract world into existence that challenged the church. But wait, before we say, oh, good for Luther, he was so great, does the Catholic Church have a point? Now, I'm going to use this song, Ba Ba Black Sheep, as an analogy, right? It's a very simple song. It's a children's song. Ba ba black sheep, have you any wool? Yes, sir, 3 bags full, etc. Now, what is the important point of that song? Is it about a talking sheep, a phenomenon? Is it about the sheep's generosity, a value? Or is it about literally the amount of wool a sheep can produce, which is a fact? Which one? It's hard to determine, right? Now, how about this? Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father except through me. That's from John 14:6 in the Bible. So, this raises a lot of questions too. And not only this passage, right, but the entire Bible raises a lot of questions. Is this saying that Jesus is the only way, the only truth, the only life? Is Jesus some sort of gatekeeper that we encounter when we go to heaven that lets us in? Should we try and be like Jesus through his words in the Bible? What about the rest of the Bible? Or should we try and literally be like Jesus? Sell everything, give away everything we own and wander around like a mendicant and die at age 33. Well, that's too much for most people to stomach probably. So there's probably going to be some sort of interpretation or many interpretations that people have of this. So the Catholic Church's question is, the question it presents is, do you believe in an institution that's 1,500 years old, has thought and written extensively about this, some of the smartest people in the world telling you what to think about the Bible, or are you going to trust the Bible's interpretation to Bob so-and-so at the corner church who happens to read the Bible once in a while between working and then gives a sermon every Sunday? Or do you yourself feel qualified to answer that question? Who is qualified to save your soul? So the stakes, right, of throwing out the Catholic Church and its teachings are pretty high. And now we engage the Renaissance, another development in the early 1500s, Back to the Future. It's a French word meaning rebirth, a rebirth of classical knowledge. Renaissance thinkers self-consciously separated themselves from the medieval Dark Ages. And yes, we get this term Dark Ages from these Renaissance thinkers. They were the first group of people to come along in Western society and say what came before us was worse than what we're going to do. It's even worse, right, than what happened way long time ago, than the knowledge we accumulated a long time ago during the ancient Greek and Roman days. And the art, was better back then, and everything was pretty much better about those times. So we're going to bring those things into the future. And here we see some medieval art. Petrarch often is known as the original Renaissance man, also sort of known as the first humanist. His claim to fame is, you didn't climb for leisure at this time, but he climbed this 6,000-foot Mount Ventoux, and as he was sitting there at the very top of it, he was reading Augustine's Confessions, and comparing Augustine's Confessions, this word of a human, versus this beautiful landscape in front of him, he said, well, look, these human words, these human ideas are just as, if not more beautiful than this landscape that God created. A very humanist, right, statement to make. Now, the Renaissance is characterized by a surge of interest in classical scholarship. And here we have their paintings by Raphael. And what is important here is that these ancient scholars revered the gods, but they placed humans at the center of their thoughts and actions. And that sounds a little scientific, doesn't it? So now we're going back to the future with science. A new interest in human bodies and environments arose simultaneously with a new interest in human souls, right? There's a lot that is similar between Luther and what he's saying and early scientists and what they're saying. This interest in humanism. And since humans have the power to observe, record, and compare results from experiments, for instance, they can access truths about themselves in the world without supernatural help. And that is a big deal. We can answer, how old is the earth? What made me sick? Etc., etc. And eventually, you come to the idea that there might be a scientific cause for everything. And if it's unknown, right, just trust that science, right, and as we move forward in time, not religion, right, is going to answer those questions. Now, this, of course, as we know, did not go over well with the Catholic authorities either. So is science a new mythology? Is it a new way of organizing time and space? Right and wrong, past and present, good, evil, reality, everything. Well, proto-scientists developed new ways to access truth. And later scientists connected and expanded those findings to create a scientific universe, truthful to itself, essentially a new mythology. But what is science anyways? Is it a method? Is it the results of the method? Or is it the application of those results in the world? Or is it all three? And who's qualified to answer that question? Scientists themselves? But which ones? They often fight amongst each other. The gatekeepers to science, which are typically government and university administrators, there's a fair amount of disagreement between them too. Or anyone who has received a scientific education, including you and I. What is truth, right? That's the ultimate goal of science. But even here, we kind of don't know what we mean by truth. Some people would just say, throw up their hands and say, there is no truth, only competing truths. Right? But that's not really satisfying, is it? Maybe others would say, whatever scientists say is true. But if so, which ones? Because as we learned, they are often fighting amongst each other. Now, maybe we can use something else here, math. Something observable, measurable, and verifiable by mathematical models. Maybe that is true. And in a lot of cases, it is. Math is an unsentimental and inarguable scientific human measurement. But it has its limitations too, at least as far as I'm aware of. Can math measure morality and immorality? Can it measure love or hate? Can it measure ambition? It seems like we need faith that science will eventually figure everything out. And that brings us to this cheeky slide. Are we going back to the future again? Now, when I read this article in Forbes, my mind nearly exploded. You must not do your own research when it comes to science. And that sounds a little bit like we shouldn't do our own research when it comes to religion. And I'm not trying to be flip here. I'm certainly not trying to be flip to Fauci. But this slide, I think, raises a couple of important questions that we're facing right now in our society. On one hand, we have a lot of experts out there, and we follow expert advice. An expert on vehicle safety would tell us, use your seatbelt when you drive, and we would all believe them. Even if we've not been in an accident, we trust that that expert opinion is right, and many, many more besides. On the other hand, we live in a free and open democratic society. A lot of us, most of us, have some sort of education, even advanced education, and we've been taught by our institutions to question them, question authority, question information. We've been taught to do research, figure things out on our own, and debate with each other about the best ways to do things, the best practices, and so forth. So on one hand, we want to believe our authorities and trust them. On the other, we have the tools to question them. We certainly, I think, don't want to go back to a system wherein we have elites at the top telling us what to do and what to think, and a benighted peasantry down below that just follows rules and has no original thoughts themselves. Anyways, early scientists did not trust science. Indeed, they did not know what science was. It was not yet any sort of formal, institutionalized body of knowledge. They were simply amazed that they could create non-religious trust. Spotlight here, Isaac Newton, alchemist, mystic, and scientist. If there's any individual, right, that deserves, I don't want to say martyr status, saint status, when it comes to science, it's probably Isaac Newton. He's a scientific saint. He developed the theory of gravity, calculus, the reflecting telescope. Basically, after Newton, there's no question that the Earth is a small planet somewhere in the universe. And yet, 1 in 10 of his writings dealt with alchemy. More dealt with biblical prophecy and the elixir of life. Here, this picture shows a treatise on Solomon's temple. Newton, we might think of as an early scientist, right? But he was just a curious guy. He had a lot of questions, and they shot off in all directions, and he didn't know which ones were scientific and which ones weren't. He pursued them all. And all of this that I've been talking about leads to this crisis of truth in Europe's mythology. Until in the 1500s, Europeans believed that the Universal Catholic Church was the intermediary between humans and God. It could be trusted as the purveyor of truth. Catholicism was Europe's mythology. But by the 1700s, this certainty was shaken to its core and replaced by a range of competing truths, a range of mythologies. Humanism, via the Protestant Reformation and the Renaissance, and scientific discoveries created a mythological rupture in Europe. What is true? As a result, the timeless Catholic and Christian ideas of heaven, hell, life and death and God could reasonably be challenged. Now, did all of this uncertainty lead to stability or strife? In other words, is this quote reassuring? All that is certain is that nothing is certain. Oh my. This is going to hurt. And it did. So we return to the printing press. The problem is now the solution. From 1500 on, new religious and scientific truths spread via print culture, and many of those were subversive. And subversive ideas led to social instability, and especially here, not knowing who holds power to stop or guide them. Because remember, some kings, some princes, some leaders are still Catholic, others embrace Protestantism. Others think science, these emerging sciences are very interesting. And so you have a vacuum of power in Europe during the 1500s and early 1600s. And this leads to the Peasants' War, the French Wars of Religion, and the 30 Years' War. And as the papacy and governments became insecure of their power, they reasserted themselves via surveillance expansion, including the Catholic Inquisition that tried to root out and find and persecute heretics, economic expansion via mercantilism and colonial projects abroad, and military expansion, the hiring of mercenary armies. And here you see this information arms race. More truth choices, more social instability leads to more elite control, leads to more suspicion by non-elites, leads to more truth choices, and it keeps going up. We need something to handle all of this new information and all of these new government ventures. Bureaucracies. That's what government settled on to manage all this stuff. And there are two forms of governments at this point in Europe, two general types. The first is called absolutism, and the second is called constitutionalism. And both are largely secular forms of government that elevated the autonomous state above the nobility and the church. Absolutism is developed in France. And this system says that the monarch sits above the law. It goes God, monarch, everything else, including the law. And Louis XIII, and then especially Louis XIV, developed this type of rule. And here we see a picture of Versailles, this mega mansion created by the French kings to demonstrate their absolute power. The second is constitutionalism, and that's developed in England and also in Poland. We don't want to forget Poland. And this says that the law is above the government. It goes God, law, and then government, including the king. Now, this comes about, at least in England, because Charles I, pictured there, looked across the English Channel and said, wow, I want what the French have. An absolutist government sounds great. But England also has a parliament, and Parliament felt itself to be strong enough to challenge the king on that. And that led to the English Civil War, Charles's beheading, and the Bill of Rights. Both forms of government worked. There was no knowledge that constitutionalism would eventually be triumphant over absolutism. They were both modern, and they both used bureaucracies. They used the same tools to essentially do the same things under different guises. After the Reformation and English Civil War, states assumed sweeping new powers. The monopolization of the use of force within their territories. No more, armies guided by the Pope. The authorization of marriages, divorces, adoptions, marriage courts, all of this, right? No longer the purview of the Catholic Church, now under state control. Restructuring of poor relief and regulations of businesses. Both forms of governments, as I've already said, relied on bureaucracies to control their growing populations and pursue their interests. Here, the other pictures here are the Bill of Rights itself and then Charles being beheaded. Bureaucracies profoundly affect statescraft and warcraft during the early modern period, exemplified by the 30 Years' War. And there you see a very complicated map of a very complicated conflict that I will not have time to completely explain. But in any case, the 30 Years' War, it began religious, it ended very secular. Secular aims, secular goals. In fact, from now on, wars will largely be fought as the result of secular concerns and interests. Religion will play a part, religious leaders will take sides and so forth, but the goals and the intentions will always be secular. So the 30 Years' War really redefines European politics, economics, and society. Up to 8 million deaths in Central Europe. Up to 50% population decline in some places. And this is totally unimaginable just 200 years before. 200 years before, in the medieval period, if you wanted to declare war, you would summon your peasants, maybe 2,000-3,000 of them, and you would fight during the fighting season in the middle of the summer, so then those individuals could be back to work and harvest in the fall. By the time we reach the 30 Years' War, warfare has taken on epic proportions as the result of the development of these bureaucracies. You have increased taxation across Europe. You also have labor that's becoming more expensive as a result of that population decline. France becomes the major power in Europe and will remain so for the next 200 or so years. And all the German principalities, German-speaking principalities in Central Europe start gaining more autonomy from the Holy Roman Empire. Even the weather changed, and this is a bit off topic, but I have a picture here of the Thames, frozen. It was called the Little Ice Age, and its peak was around the middle of the 1600s. It got very cold in Europe. Now, to paint a picture of this destruction, I want to direct you to the pictures, the lower two pictures there on the far right of the screen. 13 years into the war, in 1613, 24,000 soldiers from the Imperial Army besieged Magdeburg, Germany. After 2 months, the army laid down heavy artillery fire, and 20,000 of the city's 30,000 inhabitants were killed. As you can see here, many were hung from trees, tortured. Many dead bodies were tossed in the Elbe. There's so many clogged the Elbe that the water couldn't move. So you had bodies like floating with their hands, sticking straight up in the air. It was a devastating scene. And this, right, could not have happened just 150, 200 years prior. Also, the 30 Years' War gives rise to the potato as a staple crop in Europe. Now, why? Why would a war affect people's eating habits? Well, you can set a wheat field on fire. You can set a barley field on fire. But potatoes grow under the ground. You cannot set a potato field on fire very easily. And so potatoes come about into European cuisine as a starvation food. And so the next time you are sitting there eating baked potato or French fries, just remember you should be thankful for the 30 Years' War to give you that. So altogether, the 30 Years' War taught states that economic power, efficient taxation, political centralization, and technological innovation are the way of the future. Bureaucracies, right, are triumphant. And bureaucracies pursue this power or fix this power, ensconce their power in the world via contracts. Contracts give us the ability to fix information in a changing world. They manage money and people, and by being able to trace money and people. And the growth of state bureaucracies was aided by the growth of contracts. Contracts are everywhere in modern society. We see them in taxation, obviously, property taxes, income taxes, land taxes, right? And land taxes rely on cadastral surveys. Themselves are another kind of abstraction, right? The creation of a map to represent a piece of land. Religion also has contracts. Religions do. In different principalities, Protestant and Catholic, there are laws that clarified who could and could not own land or participate in society. Military relies on contracts. Mercenary armies, weapons contractors, for instance. Education, they confer degrees, which are basically contracts. And then the creation of those new bureaucrats coming out of these institutions, and also lawyers, right? They administer those contracts. Commerce, wholly dependent on contracts, right? Banking, stock markets, etc. And finally, colonialism, right? Colonialism is based on contracts at this time. European expansion abroad to the Americas and so forth. Contracts gave Europeans the right, quote unquote, to steal natives' land, right? If you're an individual, a Native American living in Quebec in the 1600s, you might think, oh, this land is mine. I can use this land. Until someone from the French government comes and says, oh, I'm sorry, you can't use that land or you will be killed. And the reason why you can't is a piece of paper 4,000 miles away that says that you can't. In sum, contracts help state bureaucracies know how powerful they are, what is theirs, what they can tax, what they can pursue economically, and what they can pursue militarily. And the goal here is control. So, to conclude this lecture, I will give you a quote that really summarizes, I think, exactly what bureaucracies meant to the people in power at this time. Would it not be a great satisfaction to the king to know at a designated moment every year the number of his subjects in total and by region, the number of his nobility and ecclesiastes of all kinds, of men of the robe, of Catholics, and of those of the other religion? Notice he's not even saying, right, Protestant. All separated according to the place of their residence? Would it not be a useful and necessary pleasure for him to be able, in his own office, to review in an hour's time the present and past condition of a great realm of which he is the head? And the Sun King, right, Louis XIV, this absolutist ruler, says, "Oui, oui, all praise to the bureaucracy." That's the lecture for today. Thank you very much for watching. Once again, I encourage you, if you liked the video, please click like, and I will leave these theses, the theses from today's presentation, up here on the screen.